Hello. As people start to come in, I'm just going to quickly say that we'll start the webinar in about another minute to make sure that everyone has had a chance to join the call. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon. I want to say welcome to the webinar. I think some people are still trickling in, but as we are 3 minutes after the hour, I think we can get started with the webinar. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I want to thank you for joining the SBTi Net Zero kickoff webinar for the pre-launch public consultation. This webinar kicks off the final public consultation before the release of the net zero standard later this fall. My name is Paulina Tarrant, and I'm the Net Zero Engagement Manager at SBTi. And today we're going to look into a number of things to introduce the pre-launch public consultation. I'm going to start us off with a brief welcome, and then we'll go into an introduction of the SBTi, talk a little bit more about the SBTi ambition update that we've been talking about recently, do a deep dive into the net zero standard development process, and then talk about the pre-launch public consultation, which is opening today. Finally, we will have some time to answer some questions for the audience, and then we'll wrap up the session at the end of the hour. So before we get started, I do want to remind you that this event is being recorded. The recording will be shared with attendees after the session, including the slides. The recording and slides will also be available on the Net Zero page of the SBTi website, and the link there will link to our Science-Based Targets YouTube channel. So these will be available to you after the session. And then for audience questions, we do have a Q&A function for this webinar. So I ask you to please submit your questions in the Q&A function. We will be monitoring that throughout the session and answering your questions written throughout the hour, and then saving some of them to be answered live at the end of the session. Please remember to ask your questions in the Q&A function and not through the chat, since we'll be answering those throughout the background of the meeting. And then to kick it off, I do want to introduce our speakers for today. So we have Paula Delgado, who's the head of engagement at SBTi. We have Emma Watson, who's the Senior Manager of Net Zero at SBTi, and then myself, as I've introduced myself, Paulina Tarrant, Net Zero Engagement Manager. And with that, I'll hand it over to Paula, who's going to introduce the SBTi. And yes, Paula, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Paulina. So hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. I will give you a brief introduction to the SBTi, just because some of you might not be familiar with the initiative, and provide you a little bit of context for today's topic. So 6 years ago, the Science-Based Targets initiative was launched as a collaboration between 4 partner organizations, CDP, the World Resources Institute, the UN Global Compact, and Worldwide Fund for Nature, or WWF. And also pretty much from the beginning as well, we have been collaborating and working with the Women Business Coalition. And our aim is to mobilize companies and financial institutions to set GHG targets in line with climate science, right? So we want to drive emission reductions in the real economy in line with the latest climate science. Next one, please. Can you? Great, thanks so much. So today we have over 1,800 companies that have joined the initiative, and about half of the companies have actually gone already through the process of designing their targets, submitting them for validation, and obtaining approval of the SBTi. And around half of them are in the phase of setting their targets. We also have around 800 companies that joined the Business Ambition for 1.5 Degrees campaign. This is a campaign that we launched together with partners back in June 2019 in response to the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degrees warming. And this campaign is a call to action to align corporate targets with the 1.5 ambition of the Paris Agreement. The campaign is part of the Race to Zero umbrella campaign of the UNFCCC. And as a quick reminder, I want to let companies know that we have, if you want to be showcased at COP, being part of the Race to Zero and this Business Ambition for 1.5 campaign, you should send your Business Ambition commitment letter by the latest, the 30th of September, so in a week from now. Next one, please. And we launched our progress report early this year, and for the first time ever, we reviewed the progress made against targets by a group of companies with targets set. And a highlight of this review is that companies are reducing their emissions at a rate that exceeds the minimum rate needed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And in average, companies also reduced their emissions by 25% between 2015 and 2020. And this is in contrast with global emissions from energy and industrial processes that increased emissions by about 3.4% within this time frame. So this demonstrates that science-based targets are attainable and that they are helping companies to drive ambitious emissions reductions in line with science. And what we need to do now is to scale up the adoption of these types of targets to bend the global curve of emissions. Next one, please. Okay, so on July 15 this year, we actually released our new strategy looking ahead to 2025. And the main components of our strategy are two. The first one is to scale up action in line with 1.5 degrees. And the second one is to mainstream science-based targets. And on this slide, I will show you more or less what was the timeline and the backbone of the SBTi, you know, how we have been leveraging the science to create all this infrastructure in the initiative. Important to commence with the fact that the SBTi was launched after the release of the 5th assessment report of the IPCC that was launched about, I think, in September in 2013. And at that point in time, the world was looking at 2 degrees of warming, right? That was what the IPCC 5th assessment report was talking about. And based on this ambition, which was the normal back then, the SBTi launched its call to action to the corporate sector based on 2-degree target setting. But then a couple of months later, after we launched the initiative in May 2015, so in November 2015, we had the landmark Paris Agreement, where actually the Paris Agreement introduced two new levels of ambition, right? The well below 2 degrees and the 1.5, right? Saying that we should aim to reach 1.5 degrees of warming, but at the minimum well below 2 degrees. Nevertheless, you know, even though the Paris Agreement said that, we didn't have enough modeling out there from institutions and modeling agencies to really adapt our resources to the well below 2 degree ambition. And that changed when the IPCC released its special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees in October 2018, when finally some emission modeling based on well below 2 degrees and also 1.5 degrees became available to the global community. And that's when we were able to start a process to adjust our strategy in the SBTi and also all of our resources that we launched in March 2019. And in March 2019, we also announced a change in ambition. So from, I think we gave around more than 6 months for companies to heads up to adjust, to actually prepare their targets, because basically we started, I believe, around September 2019 or 2020 to start validating targets at the minimum with well below 2 degrees ambition. And we also launched at the same time a campaign, the Business Ambition for 1.5 degrees campaign that I mentioned already in June 2019 to promote the most ambitious targets in line with 1.5 degrees. So companies committed to the 1.5 ambition via this campaign. They also committed to set net zero targets by 2050 at the latest, which is in line with the 1.5 degree goal. And we started a process to develop our net zero standard. At the beginning, we had a discussion paper that we launched in November 2019 that led to our foundation's paper for science-based targets, net zero targets, launched in September this year. And since then, we have we kicked off an inclusive and stakeholder-informed process to develop this standard. And as part of this standard, we will talk more about it in the next slides, but we are developing criteria and guidance for companies to set robust and credible net zero targets. And we are now actually just in the middle of the publication of the IPCC special report, the Physical Science Basis, that was launched last month on August, that just highlights again the need to aim for the 1.5 ambition, right? So what we knew before with the special report on 1.5 degrees launched in October 2018, it's now reinforced with this new publication of the IPCC, and hence the urgency to align our strategy to 1.5 degrees. And next one, please. So fortunately, many companies in the SBTi are already responding to this call to action to 1.5 degrees. And this year, actually, over 2/3 of the companies that set science-based targets have aligned their ambition for scope 1 and 2 emissions with 1.5 degrees. And 1.5 degrees has become now the most common ambition in the SBTi. As I mentioned as well, many companies have committed via the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree campaign, and many of these companies are already committed to setting net zero targets by no later than 2050, right? The target year is 2050 or earlier. Next one, please. And since many companies are demonstrating already that 1.5 degrees of ambition is feasible in the corporate sector, the SBTi decided to embrace the 1.5 ambition as a new minimum ambition for target setting. And the 1.5 ambition is therefore the central part of our strategy, in fact, for the coming years. So this is in response to the urgency that I mentioned from the science, right, the IPCC reports. And our aim is to scale up action in line with 1.5 degrees. So we then announced that the SBTi is taking this new step in July this year, the 15th of July, so 1 year ahead of time. So because all companies that submit targets from July 15, 2022 onwards will need to align to the new criteria, in which the new criteria indicates that 1.5 is the new minimum for scope 1 and 2. And we actually had a webinar on this ambition update on August 24th. If you want to listen to the recording, it is available on our YouTube channel with more information about the upcoming changes to the criteria. So with this, I provided you the context for what is next in our agenda. And thanks so much for your attention. I will now hand it over to Emma, who will guide you through the development of our net zero standard.
Great. Thank you very much, Paula, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. We're very excited to kick off the second public consultation of the Net Zero Standard. So today I'm just going to walk you through the Net Zero Standard development process that we've been undertaking for almost 2 years now, actually. And then I will walk you through the objectives of the pre-launch public consultation and some of the detail behind that. So Paulina, thank you very much. So the SBTi, as Paula mentioned, has been looking at what it means for a company to be net zero for almost 2 years now. And really, that's because there is a huge lack of clarity within this space in the corporate climate action space. So we've begun to develop the first global net zero standard for company target setting. And although we did publish an initial paper in September 2019, the process really kicked off, or November, sorry, 2019, the process really kicked off when we published our Net Zero Foundations paper last September. So the Foundations paper, that is available on our website if you haven't had the chance to read it. And that really spells out the foundations, essentially, of the work that we've been doing on net zero since then. So after we published the Net Zero Foundations paper, we then convened an expert advisory group to support us in developing the net zero criteria, as well as developing guidance to help companies. So that expert advisory group is around 40 people, and it's made up of experts from different areas of the space, so people from academia, science, business and civil society. So they're really there to help us and guide the process. So then we began to develop criteria, which went to public consultation at the beginning of this year, and I'll talk you through that process and the findings from that process in a bit more detail in a few slides to come. And then we began to develop the guidance that would help companies along in the target setting process. So really, we wanted to conduct this process to be as robust as possible in order to ensure that companies were setting credible net zero targets that were in line with a 1.5C future. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So as mentioned, we really wanted this to be a very balanced, transparent and inclusive process that involved all of our different stakeholders. So the best practice guidance that we used was the ICEAL standard setting code of good practice, as well as the greenhouse gas protocol standard setting process. Now, as I mentioned, we have convened an expert advisory group to help us through this process. And in the next slide, I'll talk to you through our governance structure in a bit more detail. But essentially, this expert advisory group is meant to have a very balanced representation to provide us advice and direction to develop the criteria. So we have gone through 2 phases of public consultation through this process. So obviously this starts the second phase of public consultation, and the first one went from middle of January to middle of March. But in addition to that, we've also been engaging with our permanent advisory group. So the Science Based Targets Initiative has a technical advisory group and a scientific advisory group that is a permanent fixture and source of expert guidance for the Science Based Targets Initiative in all of its projects. And really, any decisions that we've made are, of course, based on the science, but also developed through building consensus with our different stakeholder groups as well, and putting all of those decisions that are made through really rigorous and comprehensive review. So that's just a bit of background on the process. Now, if we go on to the next slide, this is here really just to give you an overview of the project governance that we have in place for the net zero standard development process. So really it's quite a tight and thorough governance structure that we have in place. So of course, we have an executive board that kind of governs the project, but they're not necessarily a decision-making body. They're just there to kind of ratify the final project where we come to. We have our advisory bodies. So as I mentioned in the last slide, we have a technical advisory group, and we also have a scientific advisory group. And as I mentioned, they input to all of the projects, but they've also sat alongside on the net zero standard project as well. But really our key consensus building body for the net zero project is our expert advisory group. And you can find out more about our expert advisory group on our website, and you can see who's part of that. Then on the right side of the slides, we have the internal science-based targets initiative teams. So within the project execution team, we have a dedicated net zero project team, as well as a wider working group. And then we also liaise with the SBTi's technical team as well. So to ensure that there's technical robustness within the standard. And then, of course, the project is overseen by our steering committee and our managing director as well, who have the final decision-making authority on technical criteria. So that just gives you a bit of background on the governance structure for the project. Now, if we go on to the next slide, I'll just talk you through some of the elements, and I won't go into too much detail, but really, I guess these are the 5 key areas that we have been working on within the Net Zero Standard project. So, of course, we have the standard development. So that includes the criteria and the manual, as well as the how-to guide. And we've actually renamed that the Getting Started guide. But that is essentially what we're looking at through this public consultation. But what sits behind that, I suppose, is also quite a lot of technical development. So we have been developing methods for companies to be able to determine residual emissions for different economic activities. We've also developed a net zero target setting tool. And I will say at this point that the net zero target setting tool is not part of the public consultation. It has been included as part of the company road test, which I'll talk you through in a bit more detail later. But the reason why that has not been included as part of the public consultation is that we're expecting some major updates to some of the pathways in the very near future. And we don't want to cause any confusion with companies having different versions of pathways. So that will actually be released in January next year for companies to be able to set the targets using that tool at that point. We've also been undertaking engagement with our stakeholders throughout the entirety of the process. So I've mentioned the road test process, which I'll talk through in more detail later, but we've of course been conducting webinars, talking to companies and other stakeholders one-on-one, working to build a pipeline of companies that will adopt the standard through the Business Ambition for 1.5C campaign, and also undertaking these public consultations. We of course have our communications and blogs and things like that, which are available on our website. There's been some useful blogs that we've been posting as well, so I would advise you to take a look at those if you have time. And then finally, the last piece of the puzzle is, of course, the target validation process. So we've been working on developing those resources for companies. So that includes a submission form for companies to submit their net zero targets, which will happen in January next year. We've also been conducting a pilot validation of some of the companies that were in the road test as well. So that just gives you a bit of a summary of all of the different elements that we've been working on over the last year or so. So if we go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this slide just gives you a kind of high-level overview of the timeline of the project. So as mentioned previously, the Net Zero Standard Development Project really kicked off last October when we convened our expert advisory group and we started to draft that initial criteria. That went out, as mentioned, to public consultation in January, which ran through March. And at that point, we were just looking at the net zero criteria. The next stage was to then take the public consultation feedback and work with our expert advisory group as well as our internal teams to refine the criteria for the road test that then happened later. We also then drafted net zero guidance. So once we had the kind of refined net zero criteria, as well as the initial version of the net zero guidance, we then recruited companies to take part in a road test. So that ran from mid-July to end of August. And now we're, of course, at the stage where we're launching the pre-launch public consultation. This public consultation is quite short, so it's a 2.5-week public consultation. So we'll invite you to send in your feedback by the 6th of October is the time that it ends. And throughout that process, we'll be finalising the net zero standard, taking in your feedback, and then finally launching the first version of the net zero standard on the 28th of October, just before COP26. Great, so if we go on to the next slide, please. So as mentioned, we did undertake a first public consultation specifically on the net zero criteria. So through this public consultation, we actually had an unprecedented amount of feedback from our stakeholders. We had almost 400 responses from a huge diversity of different stakeholders in different industries, as well as different geographies, and also different levels of commitment through the SBTi already. So as I mentioned, that public consultation was in January through to March, and then we began to analyse the feedback that our stakeholders had been giving us. And if we go on to the next slide, please. So we, as I mentioned before, we did look at, we have put out various questions throughout the net zero public consultation on the net zero criteria. At that time, the net zero criteria was blocked into 5 different areas. And through that public consultation, we were able to make some key decisions that have now been input into the net zero criteria and are out for public consultation now. So I'll just walk you through some of those key decisions that were made through that public consultation. So the first section that we looked at was the time frame of science-based targets through net zero commitments. So at the moment, companies are allowed to set 15-year science-based targets through the Science Based Targets Initiative. What we learned from the public consultation was that there is actually a preference for companies to be setting 10-year max timeframe targets. And we'd also seen already that most companies were actually already setting 10-year timeframe targets. So after we got that feedback, we have reduced the maximum time frame for near-term science-based targets to be 10 years. One question that is open to public consultation for this public consultation, sorry, is whether or not companies that have long asset lifespans should be able to set 15-year science-based targets as well. So that's one of the open questions that we have through this public consultation. The second key decision point that was made was to increase the near-term science-based targets ambition, and that really fed into the increase in the SBTi strategy as a whole, which Paula walked you through earlier. So at the moment, companies can set science-based targets aligned to well below 2C for scope 1 and 2. And that level of ambition is going to be increased from July 2022 for all companies. However, if your company wants to set a net zero target, they will have to align their scope 1 and 2 minimum ambition to 1.5C before that deadline as well. When we're looking at the ambition of scope 3 for near-term science-based targets, so previously companies could set scope 3 targets in alignment with 2 degrees Celsius. Now that has to be in line with well below 2C. So that ambition has also increased. When we were looking at the long-term science-based targets, so in the net zero criteria that went for public consultation, this was actually called just the net zero target, but now we've included a specific term for the emission reductions that are required as part of net zero, and that's the long-term science-based target. But really, one of the things we were looking at is whether absolute and intensity targets could be allowed in the long term, whether you could combine the scopes. And through the public consultation and working with the EAG, we determined that we would be able to allow both absolute and intensity targets and combined scope targets as well, as long as they were, of course, aligned with 1.5C outcomes. So since then, we have developed approaches for long-term science-based target setting to help companies then determine those residual emissions using the different methods that are available. And of course, those methods were piloted during the company road test, which I'll talk about shortly. The next key decision that we looked at was what the boundary of a long-term science-based target and net zero commitment in general should be. So through the public consultation, we found that there is a very strong preference for 100% of companies' emissions to be included in a net zero target, and also that the emission reduction boundary should be the same as the net zero boundary. So we have therefore included a requirement for at least 95% of a company's scope 3 emissions to be covered in the target boundary as well. And that's consistent with the requirement in scope 1 and 2. So for the long-term SBT, you have to have 95% of scope 1 and 2 and 95% of scope 3 as well. Then coming on to the net part, I suppose, of net zero, we had also put to consultation quite a few criteria around neutralization. And what we found through the public consultation was that these criteria really needed further refinement. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. But in order for us to refine that criteria, we're working with our expert advisory group and other stakeholders as well to conduct further research in this area in more detail. In the meantime, we've removed the requirement for a specific quantitative neutralization target. So one of the questions that we put out was, did a company need to say, they will neutralize X amount of tons in 2050? We've removed that requirement to simplify the framework, but we have included a high-level requirement for companies to then neutralize residual emissions when their long-term science-based target is reached. And then finally, again, the compensation criteria and recommendations, we found that they needed further refinement. So that work, again, will continue. But we have included a recommendation around this area within the version of the net zero standard that's out for consultation at the moment. Great. Okay. So if we go on to the next slide, please. And again, I mentioned earlier that we had a huge amount of feedback to the net zero standard. So this is really just a selection of statements from the open feedback that we received. And this comes from the public consultation feedback report, which is available on our website, so you can look at it in much more detail. But we just wanted to show some of the key statements that our stakeholders fed to us during that process. So I'm not going to read through these, but I think one of the key areas of feedback was that a lot of stakeholders were looking for us to simplify the language around the net zero standard. And that's one of the key things that we've been looking for through the survey that we'll ask you to fill out through the public consultation is, have we been able to simplify it? Is it clear to you? And do you understand it? So that's one of the key things that we've tried to take on board as much as possible as well. So I think moving on from here, that's all we have on the first public consultation. If we go on to the next slide, please. So the next step in the process was to take the net zero criteria that had been refined and the guidance and to take that to a company road test. So as mentioned, that went from the middle of July to the end of August, and we had 84 companies participate in the road test. So we were really aiming for diversity again of industries, geographies, but also different emission profiles to take part in that road test. And also throughout the process, we engaged with companies through workshops and office hours to help them understand and to help us refine the guidance that's now out for public consultation. Through this process, companies were also able to apply for a pilot validation phase as well. So 30 of those companies did apply for that validation, and they're helping us refine that process as well before we launch in January. So if we go on to the next slide, please, I think now I'm just going to walk you through the pre-launch public consultation. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So for the pre-launch public consultation, we've got three key objectives. The first of which is to gather feedback on the clarity, robustness, and practicality of the criteria and guidance. So that's probably the real main objective of this consultation. The second objective is to understand support for the SBTi's direction of travel and also where we've placed our focus on emissions abatement, and I'll talk about that in a minute as well. And of course, we're very keen to engage both directly and indirectly with our external stakeholders to build support, but also to identify areas of improvement for the standards. And of course, the consultation is open today and will end on the 6th of October. Go to the next slide, please. So just to walk you through the key elements of the net zero standards and to get you a bit used to the terminology that we're using. So the first element of a net zero commitment for a company would be a near-term science-based target. So this is previously what we just called science-based target, but we've added the near term to be a bit more specific when in the context of the net zero standard. So this is a 5 to 10 year reduction target in line with 1.5C pathways, and it includes all of the company's value chain emissions as well. The long-term science-based target is essentially a new science-based target to determine the level of emissions that are left when a company has abated emissions in line with global net zero scenarios that limit warming to 1.5C. So that, for most companies, means to reduce their emissions by at least 90%. And then once they've done that, any residual emissions that remain should be neutralized to reach net zero. So again, for most companies, this is going to be a maximum of 10% of their base year emissions. What's important to note is that a net zero commitment comes at the same time as reaching, or net zero target is reached at the same time as the long-term science-based target. So a company can't claim to be net zero before they've reached that level of decarbonisation that is required in global net zero scenarios. In a transition to net zero, companies are also encouraged to take action or make investments to mitigate emissions beyond the value chain. So this could be by purchasing high quality jurisdictional RED+ credits, for example, or to investing in technologies that remove carbon. So there's a flexibility around that, but those are two examples of the investments that companies could make on top of achieving and implementing a science-based target strategy. And if we go on to the next slide, please. And I mentioned previously that we were undertaking further work to understand what our role is within the kind of net piece of net zero. So we're doing an external piece of work to figure that out at the moment. But really, the SBTi net zero standard is built around what we call the mitigation hierarchy. So first of all, companies should be reducing their emissions as much as possible to align with global net zero. And then, of course, so they would calculate their greenhouse gas emissions, set both near and long-term science-based targets. They would implement a climate mitigation strategy and, of course, disclose progress on those targets annually. However, we also recognise the need for companies to go further if they are able to. So, of course, we then encourage companies to make these investments and take action to mitigate emissions outside of their own science-based targets as well, to accelerate the transition to net zero. So in the near term, we do encourage companies to invest in a variety of different actions, as I mentioned previously, but in the long term, companies should be neutralizing residual emissions with equivalent removals. However, that is expected to be quite some time in the future. If we go on to the next slide, please. So within the public consultation, we've developed guidance documents to help assist the target setting process. And these are available on our website now. So the first one is the Getting Started guide. And this is a kind of easier to digest guide to help you set both near and long-term science-based targets in alignment with the net zero standard. It also includes our plans for updating the 1.5C pathways for near-term SBTs, a comparison of both near and long-term science-based targets, and also some of the sector-specific guidance and requirements in the long term as well. And then, of course, we have the Net Zero Corporate Manual and Criteria. So this is a longer document. It's a 6-part manual that has detailed guidance and includes information on terminology, the mitigation pathways that we use, the criteria, and also a section on updating and communicating your targets as well. So this really makes up the bulk of what we're looking at in the public consultation. And then if we go on to the next slides, so after you have looked at the Net Zero Corporate Manual, within that we have the Net Zero Criteria as well. So that's laid out into 4 different sections. First section is on your near-term science-based targets. And that really lays out the requirements for science-based target setting that supersede the current requirements of SBTi at the moment. The second section is about the long-term science-based targets. So this really shows companies the requirements for the timeframe, ambition, and boundary for those long-term science-based targets. The third section is on the beyond value chain mitigation, so essentially the net part of net zero. And then finally, the last section is on target formulation and reporting. So that tells a company how they should formulate the target. So company A commits to net zero, X, Y, Z. So that's what is contained in there. And if we go on to the next slide, please. So after you've reviewed the guidance documents that we've provided, we have developed a survey which gathers feedback on 3 key areas. So we would request that you respond to this survey before the 6th of October. And this survey is laid out to gather feedback on 3 different areas. So first of all, the overall net zero framework. The second part is looking at how we can help overcome key challenges and the feasibility of the net zero standard. And then the third area is about the supporting materials themselves. So how easy were they to use, how clear were they, etc., etc. And I think with that concludes my slides. So I'll pass back over to Paulina, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Paula, for presenting. I'm going to review some of the Q&A that has been, the questions that have been coming in the Q&A function. I see that the Q&A has been quite busy, so we're doing our best to answer as many of those as possible. Just as a reminder, if we don't get to your question, we encourage you to please review the materials that Emma just reviewed that were released today for the pre-launch public consultation, and those are available on the Net Zero website. And we'll also use some of your questions to guide the drafting of an FAQ coming out for the launch of the Net Zero standard. And yeah, so with that, I'm going to start with some of the questions. I think briefly, there was a question on how road testing, or was related to road testing company distribution, how those were chosen. And I think I can go ahead and answer that question quickly, and then maybe Emma can fill it in. But essentially the road test companies, there were about 80 companies in the road test, and those companies were invited through either being part of the business ambition for 1.5 or having already set 1.5 degree targets. And we, in choosing companies, try to have as much of a diverse representation as possible from an industry and regional perspective. And so we had a lot of interest there, and tried to have that have as large of a scope as possible. And then I'm going to pass this question on to Emma Powell, but there was a question on what are the new options for companies to commit to SBTi. I think the question was whether a company needs to be 1.5 degree aligned, or if they have to set a net zero target. So what is the requirement essentially to be part of SBTi?
Yeah, I can go ahead with that, Emma. Yes, so as I mentioned before, we just released a new strategy. The core of it's the 1.5 ambition, but we released it 1 year before time. So basically, all companies that join the SBTi and that submit targets after the 15th of July of 2022, they will have to align their ambition with 1.5 degrees. However, just to make the clarification, all companies with targets set today, they can keep them. We have, even if they are aligned with well below 2 degrees, we have in our criteria a criterion that says that companies should review their targets at the minimum every 5 years, and to make any adjustments needed, for example, to align to the latest SBTi criteria then, right? So companies have maximum 5 years to make those adjustments. So that's what will happen with companies that have already targets set today. Of course, with the net zero framework, many companies might choose to update actually their near-term science-based targets earlier than that, and adjust already with and align with the 1.5 ambition. And regarding the net zero commitment part, so the companies have at the moment the option of committing to net zero via the Business Ambition for 1.5 Degrees campaign. So in the commitment letter of the Business Ambition campaign, companies have two options. Option one is to set near-term science-based targets in line with 1.5 degrees across all relevant scopes. So scopes 1, 2, and 3 if relevant. And the option two is to commit to, of course, also setting these near-term science-based targets, but also committing to net zero by no later than 2050. That's the option that companies have today, to commit to net zero and to be part of the companies committed to net zero via the SBTi, and that are also recognized in the Race to Zero umbrella campaign. I don't know if I missed anything, Emma, that you would like to add? Okay. Was that the question, Paulina, or was there?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there is also there are a number of questions related to the path to getting to net zero and then being at net zero. So maybe Emma, that's a question for you, but maybe some clarity on what encouraging compensation on the way of getting there means, and what you get to at net zero. I think, yeah, I'll pass that to you.
Okay, I can see a few questions. They're all kind of on a similar vein. I see one that says, can companies set the long-term target year, or is it always 2050? For example, could they commit to reach net zero at 2040 if they achieve a 90% reduction and get that target validated by SBTi? So companies can, of course, set earlier targets than 2050. 2050 is the max year. So it's probably quite unlikely, but say a company was able to reach net zero and the 90% emission reductions in the next 5 to 10 years, that would actually negate the need for a near-term science-based target as well. So it is possible to have a 5 year a time frame of 5 years for a long-term science-based target, but perhaps extremely unlikely. So it ranges. The question was around, I'm just trying to look for the one that you said about compensation. Sorry about that.
I think it was related to the kinds of claims on the way to net zero.
Yeah, so yeah, on the way to net zero, we at the moment we are, as I said, we're working on an additional project to try and figure this out in a bit more detail. So at the moment, we are not saying really that any claim is wrong. If I think someone asked if carbon neutrality was, you know, a wrong claim to make in the transition to net zero, and I wouldn't say that's necessarily a wrong claim, but we're not providing any guidance on claims in the transition period at the moment. It's something that we're deciding on whether we should play a role in this space or if it's best left to others. So that's a bit of a to be confirmed in the future piece of work for the Science-Based Targets Initiative. But at the moment, we're just kind of looking at what a credible net zero claim is.
Thank you, Emma. I'm just doing a quick scan of some more questions coming in here. I see a question asking whether having a 1.5 aligned SBT means that you're aligned with net zero. I can answer that quickly. That just means that you have a 1.5 aligned near-term target, but in order to have to get to the net zero point for net zero standard, you need to have a long-term target, unless you are setting a long-term net zero point that is within the next 10 years. So as Emma said, that the net zero standard is latest by 2050, but you can set it earlier. So that is that would be the case for that. We are reaching the end of the session. So unless Emma or Pao, you have something else that you would like to share, I might just move on to the wrap up to make sure that we share with the audience the materials and they have all the information that they need to have to get started with the public consultation. Okay.
Good.
Great. So with that, as was mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that we do have the business ambition for 1.5 degrees commitment letter. And if you would like to have your commitment showcased by COP, please submit this letter by the end of the month. And again, the pre-launch public consultation is launched today, and it'll be open for 2.5 weeks, closing on October 6th. So we encourage you to provide your comments before the final launch of the net zero standard. You can find all of the materials, including the criteria, the corporate manual, an overview of the public consultation questions, and then the getting started guide mentioned before on the SBTi net zero webpage. The link is here. And the public consultation survey is through SurveyMonkey. Also, the link is here, and these are linked on our website as well. As a reminder, the recording of this webinar and the webinar that we had for an earlier time zone earlier today will be shared with you after the session. They'll be posted on the Science Based Target Initiative's YouTube channel and also linked through the SBTi Net Zero webpage. And we weren't able to get to all of your questions, but we're hoping that we'll be able to get to most of them down the line. And please feel free to reach out to us with any other questions. And with that, I want to say thank you again to Emma and Paula for presenting, and thank you to our audience for attending. And we're really excited to have the final public consultation launched, and we really look forward to reading all of your input. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day.